Before we begin today, we want to thank our newest patrons, Avi, Lee, Joanna, Liz, Fionuts, and Julia. Welcome to the team. And as always, if you're interested in hearing Becca's first thoughts on persuasion, hanging out with us on Discord, and submitting your very own study questions, check out our Patreon at patreon.com/pod and prejudice. Now, we're taking a quick break from persuasion this week to discuss a brand new book called Dashed by Amanda Quain, which happens to be on sale today, July 16th. We're going to be back with a new episode about persuasion in 2 weeks, followed by another quick detour to discuss another brand new book, Elizabeth of East Hampton by Audrey Belezza and Emily Harding. And then after that, we will continue full steam ahead with persuasion. But until then, please enjoy this week's episode covering Dashed by Amanda Quain with none other than Amanda Quain. If Becca were here, she would say, "This is Becca." And I would say, "This is Molly." And then Becca would say, "Well, we're here to talk about Jane Austen." And then I would say, "We're here specifically to talk about Dashed by Amanda Quain." And we are joined today by Amanda Quain. Hello.
Hi, Molly and Becca's ghost.
Yes, so listeners, you probably have figured out by this point that it is just me today. Becca sends her regards, but she unfortunately is unable to make it to this recording. But I'm so excited to be chatting with Amanda, the author of Dashed, who you all may remember when we had her on for Accomplished, her story that followed Georgiana Darcy. So, Amanda, welcome. Do you wanna just tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yes, so I'm so excited to be back here. My name's Amanda Quain, and I am the author of now 3 Jane Austen retellings for a young adult audience, which is wild to say, because last time that we recorded, I hadn't even had one come out, and now here we are. And I work for indie bookstores by day, as well as a university administrator, and then by night, and also kind of by day sometimes. I write these fun little romance books that talk about, different characters from our favorite Jane Austen novels.
You're literally living my dream, working at an indie bookstore and writing novels in your free time, like, that's literally the dream. So we always ask our guests what their relationship is to Jane Austen, and since you're a returning guest, we also are gonna ask you how your relationship to her has changed since we last spoke, if it has.
Yeah, it's interesting because I was thinking about that. I'm like, on the one hand, it feels weird that it hasn't, but on the other hand, like, I don't know, I feel like I've been lucky that I've always kind of seen her books and what I've drawn from them as like an inspirational, like, she's obviously not a peer because she's wonderful and fantastic and dead, all of which really rules that out. But I do feel so lucky that over the last few years, I've been able to like make a very small mark on the Jane Austen canon and that I am now like a tiny part of her legacy. But I've always been a huge Austen fan. I got my first copies of her books. I got a full set of the Dover Thrift editions when I was like 13. Started Pride and Prejudice first, finished Sense and Sensibility first. That was my
Ooh.
first love. Yeah, I had to come back to Pride and Prejudice. I was like 14. We pick and
Mhm.
choose. And
Yeah.
then in college was super lucky to take a class that was just called Jane Austen, where we read each of her books. And they had a different professor come in and discuss each book based on like what their specific discipline was. So like we had a Gothic professor come in for Northanger Abbey, that sort of thing.
Oh,
It was amazing.
that's so cool.
Yeah, and then I've just, like, never stopped. I've always been a fan of adaptations and retellings and, like, essentially fanfic, which is basically what we're doing. I know we talked about Neopets fanfic last time I was here.
Oh my gosh, yes, I remember that. So you have 3 now. You have Accomplished, you have Ghosted, which is Northanger Abbey, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so we'll read that eventually.
Yes.
Um, and now Dashed, which is a Sense and Sensibility inspired.
Yes, I decided for my 3rd book I had to do something that I knew you had read so that we could come on and talk about it. Because I was like, "Well, that was no fun when we couldn't chat about Northanger Abbey."
Right, honored to be a part of that decision, honestly. So you talked about what your first Austen love was. What is your current favorite piece of Austen content? Whether that's a book that she wrote or a spin-off piece of content or a song or, anything.
Honestly, I just rewatched the other day Fire Island, and I think it's still
Oh,
standing as my normally, it would be Clueless as, like, I feel like I, like, have to separate the adaptations as, like, a separate category because, like, obviously,
totally.
Sense and Sensibility is my favorite Austen novel, and so that's always a special place in my heart, but, like, Fire Island is a perfect adaptation.
It really is.
I'm obsessed with it.
We went to, we being me and my girlfriend went to the Las Culturistas Culture Awards,
Oh
and
my gosh.
it was like the cast of Fire Island was there, and we were just like, "Wow, we love this movie."
Oh my gosh. The perfect combination of, like, queer culture and Austen culture. Congratulations,
Yes.
honestly, and, like, nailing that.
Yeah, it's so good.
It proved to be a very good treadmill movie, which I
Oh,
appreciated.
yeah.
Yeah, it's, like, just bouncy enough, but also, like, I know the story, so if I'm, zoning out in the pain zone, I can come back to it. But, I mean, that
Yeah.
script just doesn't stop. Plus, they literally say "way harsh tie."
I know, which I didn't get
Yeah.
when I first watched it, and then when I was watching Clueless, I was like, "I get it now."
I literally screamed when I heard it the first time, and then screamed again on the treadmill because I forgot that it was in there.
Yeah. Oh my god, it's so funny. So, Austen characters. We normally ask which Austen character you relate to the most, but since you're a returning guest, we're gonna ask you which Austen character you love to hate.
Ooh, that's interesting. I mean, honestly, it's probably I feel like it might be Willoughby, frankly,
Mhm.
because
Mhm.
there are some North End grabby ones that I won't go into for your sake, but, like, Willoughby is such a tragic hero because he's not the villain that Wickham is, and he and Marianne were so well matched. Would it last the distance? Impossible to say, but, like, theirs was such a good love story, and then he messed it up so badly by his own stupid decisions, and I'm just like, "Ugh, I just wanna hit him."
Yeah, I feel like Willoughby and Frank Churchill are 2 characters that, like, you want to be more clean cut or, like, clear cut than they are. Like, you're
Yeah.
like, "Ooh, you're bothering me," but also, like, there are good aspects of your story. I mean, Frank Churchill more so is, like, he's not a bad guy,
Yeah, his
but,
situation's
like
just funky.
yeah, but, like, Willoughby, he really loved her. I
Yeah.
mean, that's valid. It's just that he's also an asshole.
Yeah. So I actually
Yeah.
in, like, a slight honor of Willoughby, I named the cruise ship that they sail on in Dash after Willoughby's horse, the Queen Mab.
I loved that. There were so many good, like, tidbits
I'm so glad
inside
you picked
of
up on that. It was, like, such a, like that's probably the most subtle Easter egg in there.
and it's such a good name for a boat.
Exactly. Like, I was like, I said I like, because I was, I always when I start these books, I do read, like, the Spark Note summaries of all the books or of the
Mhm.
novel that I'm doing just to, like, make sure I'm not missing any, like, major plot points that maybe, like, don't stand still in my heart, but are, like, important for the books, and when I hit that, I'm like, "Oh, done. That's perfect."
Yes. So that's actually a great segue into talking about Dashed. So we're going to be releasing this on the day that Dashed goes on sale to the public, which is very exciting.
Yes, and so soon. Oh my goodness.
So soon. Literally, we're recording this on Saturday and it's going on sale on Tuesday. Ah! You must be bouncing off the walls.
Yeah, I'm literally, like, after we do this recording, like, finishing packing my car and driving out to start hitting my tour stops for, like, the little
Oh
mini
my
tour I'm
gosh.
doing.
Amazing. Wait, where is your first stop?
So I'm going back to DC, which is where I've lived for like 8 years and where my bookstore still is.
Okay.
In Northern Virginia, but we're staying in DC. So I still do my launches there, even though I live in Pennsylvania now. So we're going down there and we'll be there for a few days. And then we're heading up to Ocean City, New Jersey, where my parents live and where I went to high school. And I'm doing an event there on Saturday.
That'll be awesome.
Yeah.
So, we don't wanna give away too many spoilers, but we are gonna talk about a lot of plot points in this story, so I guess you all should go buy the book,
Yes.
but we're gonna do our best to not give everything away. So, without giving away everything, what is the concept of Dashed? Tell us about it.
Perfect. So I will start by saying that like I love that in this context, I can actually talk about the Jane Austen like version of it because I normally try when I'm pitching my books to be like not just be like, here's my Jane Austen nerd out, because I want it to be approachable to people who aren't huge Austen fans as well, and they are.
Totally.
But for you all, I can say that this is a contemporary retelling, or excuse me, a contemporary sequel to Sense and Sensibility. So, because I am a big fan of the original novel, it is my favorite of Austen's works, and I couldn't find anything I like wanted to change. So I was like, okay, well, what happens next? That's a good way to sort of solve that problem. So this follows Margaret Dashwood, our youngest Dashwood sister. She's 18 now, and basically the end of Sense and Sensibility kind of messed with her head. We're really seeing for her the fallout of how she's always idolized Marianne and her adventurous spirit, and how she always went after love. And then she saw what happened to Marianne over, in our case, Will, which in our novel is that she got into a really terrible car accident after they broke up and was, hospitalized for a long time. And Margaret saw that and was like, nope. Love is not worth it. Love is terrible. I see what Eleanor is doing, which in her mind is like finding a nice man who she loves enough to sort of settle down with and have a nice, sensible life. And I'm going to do that. So she basically sends what happened with Marianne 6 years ago. She has really stuck to the line. She's a real rule follower. She doesn't have time for romance. And she's about to go on a little adventure. Eleanor's husband, Edward, who we all know and love, has taken a 6-week post on a cruise ship, the Queen Mab, as a ship's chaplain, which is a boat priest. And he's allowed to bring his family along. So Eleanor and Margaret and him are going to go on this six week Caribbean cruise. And at the last second, Marianne shows up in tears and is like, Brandon and I are over. We broke up. I'm coming with you, and throws Margaret's life into an absolute tailspin. So that's sort of where we start off here. And I am sorry in advance for breaking up Marianne and Brandon. I feel bad about it.
I read that and I was like, "No!" But, I won't spoil how that ends, but I was
Yes.
devastated. Um, so we're on a cruise ship.
Yes.
I know that you posted on Instagram that you also do a lot of cruising yourself or, like, have throughout your life. So, first of all, what made you put this specific book on a ship? And second of all, what about the setting of Sense and Sensibility lent itself to telling this sort of modified story or sequel in the modern era on a cruise ship?
Yeah, it's funny because this book this book gave me some trouble, Molly. This book was a challenging one, which I think a lot of third books are because this was the first book. I think for a lot of folks, it's their second books that give you trouble, but I was lucky that I wrote the entirety of Ghosted before Accomplished came out. So I was dealing with a little bit less like public pressure. I mean, I don't know. I haven't dealt with that much public pressure, but you still like I wasn't dealing with any of like the public's thoughts on my book. So for
Mhm.
this one, it was a weird one going into it. And initially this was an extremely different book.
Mm.
Initially this was Margaret going to stay with Edward and Eleanor in like the tiny beach town they live in
Oh,
and having to discover that like their way of life is a nice way of life and that it's okay to have a boring way of life.
yeah.
And that like being settled is a good thing. And my editor was like, "This is a very quiet story." I'm like, "I know, the point is that quiet stories are nice." And she's like, "That's not a sellable point, actually." So we kinda had to go entirely back to the drawing board. And I was literally just brainstorming with, my critique partner, and I just sort of out of nowhere, I was like, "What if they were just, like, on a boat? What if we just put them on a big boat for a long time?" We're like, "Wait, what if they were on a boat, actually?" It was a really fun setting to get to explore. Like I've mentioned on my social media, I grew up cruising. I'm from Florida originally, and cruises are kinda just like a thing people do a lot there because you just drive to the port and you get on the ship and off you go. Plus, my grandparents, are huge cruisers. Before my grandmother died, my grandparents went on 55 cruises together.
Oh my god.
I know, they would just, like, stay on the ship between cruises sometimes. They, like, knew all the
Wow.
crew, it was wild. So I got to do a lot of that, and so I was just very familiar with the setting. I was like, "This will be a really fun, sort of over the top, really exciting summer setting," and since Northanger Abbey and Ghosted was a much darker and more emotional book. Like, it's still fun and funny, but it's definitely darker than Accomplished is. I kinda wanted to go in an entirely different direction and have, like, a real summery book.
Mhm.
And so once we sort of came up with the setting, we almost like the story kinda came together because of the setting,
Totally.
which was not the way I usually do things, but it was an interesting way to go about it.
It really felt like reading it, this story could only happen on a cruise ship, and a cruise ship is such a good incubator for I mean,
Yes.
any, like, enclosed space is a good incubator for a story, but, like, when you're literally on a boat and you are in the middle of like, you can only get off at the various ports that you're on, so, like, it just that's obviously gonna inform the story. I think that worked really well. And, like, jumping back to something you said earlier about this, like, appealing to people outside the Austen,
Mhm.
like, fandom, I think doing it as a sequel really helps with that because there are elements of the original story in there, like, in Margaret's flashbacks
Right.
and such, but it is its own story, which I think is really smart on your part.
Thank you. Yeah, this one is definitely a lot more self-contained than my first 2 books. It really can be read as just, like, a fun summer rom-com, and if you happen to pick up the Austen references, amazing, but since it is a sequel, yeah, it's completely its own thing.
Yeah. So we've got Accomplished, we've got Ghosted, we've got Dashed. I wanna know why Sense and Sensibility was your next choice, aside from obviously wanting to talk about it with me,
Yes.
um, and whether you intend to do a book for each Austen book.
I would love to eventually. It's not in the immediate cards,
Mhm.
but I'm gonna be taking a little pause from this at least like basic genre for now, but I would love to eventually reach all of them. Honestly, a lot of it is like I knew I wanted to do another Austen because that's what my publisher wanted, which was amazing. I mean, I love doing them.
Mhm.
And so I was kind of looking at what was left. And for me, retellings are interesting. I think this is the way for a lot of retelling authors because it can't just be a book that you love. It needs to be a book that you have something to say about.
Totally.
Because, like, I love Persuasion deeply and thoroughly. I'm so glad you all are talking about it right now. But it's like, well, if I don't have anything to say about it except for I love this very much, that's not so much a retelling as it is like a book club.
Mhm.
So, which was honestly challenging because I was like, well, Sense and Sensibility makes sense because it'd be good to go back to a more well-known Austen after I like threw Northanger Abbey at everybody. But I don't have anything to say about it except for I love it. Um, so that's kind of when I was like, okay, but like what elements exist that like are ripe for sort of retelling and adaptations. Like, well, we don't know much about Margaret, and I always loved her, especially in the adaptation, the movie. She's such a cute little fun adventure, you know, with her big map hiding under the table from Hugh
Oh, I
Grant.
love it.
It's so
Yeah.
cute. And I was very curious where she would sort of end up, and I think also Sense and Sensibility, although it's my favorite, does always have the Marianne and Brandon question, right? Like, is this what Marianne deserves. This is what Brandon deserves. Like, is this a love story that can stand up to Eleanor and Edward, you know, Darcy and Lizzie? Like, theirs has always been a little bit more of a confusing one for me, a little bit more of a
Mhm.
subtle. I I don't wanna
You can say it.
yeah, yeah, it's never been my absolute favorite. I mean, obviously Alan Rickman pulls it out, but when you look at the books on its own, it's like, this is fine, but I've often felt a little weird about it for Marianne because it does seem like she had to
Yeah.
give up on her dreams and what she really wanted. And so this was an opportunity to not only explore Margaret, but Marianne is a fairly major character in the story as we sort of explore what her journey should be and what her journey ends up being with love now that she and Brandon have broken up and Margaret is determined to find her new love because this is of course also a fake dating book
Of course.
and we are throwing Marianne into as many situations as possible to try to find her love again.
Yeah. I'm glad you said that about Brandon. Becca's not here and we're gonna go off the rails, but when we first read Sense and Sensibility, Marianne and Brandon got together in the last, like, 2 pages of the book,
Yeah.
and I was like, "I feel like something's missing here," and Beck was like, "No, he's so romantic," and, like, listen, Becca, I know you're gonna listen to this, and I agree with you, he is so romantic, but is that like, did Marianne ultimately well, actually, I guess we did talk about this, but ultimately, Marianne had the kind of sensible
Mhm.
relationship settle that Margaret in your book thinks of Eleanor as having, and Eleanor had the, like, big romantic
Right,
sweep
right.
me off my feet. So they, like, did a swapsies on what you expect from each of them, actually, although I can see how Margaret would see it the other way around and, like, not fully know the internal life of her sisters and their romances because she's only seeing the outside of it.
Exactly, and she's so much younger than them too, you know,
Yeah.
that makes it and I've made the age difference even a little bit longer in my book than it is in the original just because, you know,
Yeah.
I don't have my, like, 17-year-olds getting married.
Yes.
They're not that young in the novel, but, you know, we stretch it out a little bit just to play with, you know, marriage and things like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's hard because we do love Brandon, but yeah, it happens so quickly and it does seem so subtly. And so a lot of this is like exploring, was this the right thing for Marianne too?
Yeah. So, I'm sensing a theme. You have Georgiana Darcy.
Yes.
I don't know about Ghosted, so I won't get into that.
Ghosted, our main character, is a middle of 3.
Okay, so we've got, like, the siblings, like, the kind
Yes.
of adjacent characters that you're bringing as your main characters of your, spinoffs. So, you've talked a little bit about it, I think, with talking about what you have something to say about,
Mhm.
within the novel, but why did you choose Margaret, if you had to distill it, as your narrator for this book?
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting that I do tend to pick a lot of younger siblings,
Mhm.
despite being the oldest of 2 siblings myself. Like, I am such an older sister. I've got big Eleanor energy.
I love it.
Like, this is not my vibe at all, but I also think there's something very interesting about exploring different types of relationships within novels.
Mhm.
Like, if I was just putting my own personal, you know, big sister dump on this, like, that's at a point, that's just therapy. I pay somebody to do that. I don't need to, you know, make you all read about that. But I really enjoy sibling relationships. It's one of the things that first drew me to Jane Austen and Accomplished was the way that she does families, which is obviously something we all love about her. Like the family relationship is such an important part of her books alongside the romantic relationships.
Mhm.
And I am also, this is like maybe more of a writer flaw than a reason. I lose friends so easily in these books. I cannot tell you how many friends have been cut from the page
Oh my gosh.
because I just get too excited about the siblings and I forget to do anything with the friends.
Yeah.
So you kinda have to cut like, I couldn't do, like, a Lucy novel or anything like that because I just would have lost half the characters along the way, like,
Right.
in Dashed, Dash was the earliest I ever cut, like, a best friend type because early in my Dashed drafting, Gabe, who's sort of our love interest crew member, had a cousin, Clara, who was, like, Margaret's best friend on the ship, and she didn't even make it out of, like, the outline.
Oh my god, that's so funny.
I can't. I like it's so funny. I lost a couple friends in Ghosted, although we did keep more friends in Ghosted. You'll see when you get there, but like
Mhm.
the friends are important there, which I was very proud I managed to do. We lost like half the friends in Accomplished. So I don't know. Siblings are just what I always come back to, and I find that the family dynamic of how they all interconnect and how it's not just like Margaret has a friend, and that friend isn't really connected to Eleanor and Edward. Like, that's not as interesting to me as like Margaret and Marianne are doing all these things together, and then there's also Eleanor and Marianne drama and Edward and Marianne thoughts. Can I take a quick side note, by the way, and say how annoyed I am at Jane Austen for naming these two characters Marianne and Margaret?
Oh my god, yeah.
The amount of times I typed the wrong name in this book is absurd.
I do that in my notes all the time with so many of her characters. First of all, being named the same
Yeah,
name.
they're just all Jane anyway.
Yeah, exactly. Or just like the same last initial. So I like to in my notes shorten things like Mr. Blank or like Mr.
Yeah,
L
you can't.
there's no Mr. L, but you can't because then I'm like, who am I talking about?
A Mr. L would be helpful. That would be nice.
Yeah.
Please, Jane.
Yeah, exactly. Instead, all of her villains are W's
Right.
and everybody else is John or Jane,
Yeah.
which is also like, okay, yeah, agreed with you.
So yeah, the Marianne, if I say the wrong name here, I apologize. It's still not nearly as bad as when I was writing it out, especially the first 3 letters are the same.
I know.
Disaster. That's almost why I had to give Margaret, like, a nickname, just
Mags.
to make it easier to type. Yes, she goes by Mags among her family, which is both, like, a fun reference to the way my family always nicknames. We take, like, a syllable and add an S,
Mhm.
and also my editor, Sarah, despises it, so I had to do it.
I love that.
Just to bother her. I was like, look at these fun nicknames. What do you think, Sares?" She's like, "I'm going to murder you. Please stop."
I love that. Well, I think that, like, the family dynamic also for Margaret, it is so important to her character that, like, she even in the original books, like, she's so young and she looks up to her
Yeah,
sisters, and you do get that vibe of, like, she's just with their mom all the time, so, like, who's she gonna think is cool other than her sisters
right.
and wanna emulate them, and so, like, her getting this, like, 6 weeks with her big sister who she idolizes,
Oh my gosh, yes.
like, it makes so much sense for her.
Yeah,
But she doesn't get a lot of attention in the original book.
right.
So I'm curious, like, how you built her character and wondering if you took any inspiration from particular adaptations like the Hugh Grant one, or did you build her from scratch?
So the Hugh Grant one is always my go-to adaptation for Sense and Sensibility. Like, I know that there are others, but I frankly don't care as much about them.
Yeah.
That is the gold standard. Absolutely. Like Emma Thompson, the casting is perfect, the script is perfect, the vibes are perfect, no notes. So she's definitely like who is in my head as Margaret at that age. So that was like definitely a starting point for her at 12, but obviously we had to age her up, an additional 6 years. So it was a lot of time thinking about like how you go from somebody who was that adventurous and that wild and that romantic. Like we see in the book as well. You see it a little bit more in the book than you do in the movie. How much Sheila's like, oh my gosh, like she and their mom are like all about Marianne and Willoughby. Like they are team Willoughby, they are team big love, they are team romance. And I feel like that's a easy person for me to imagine.
Yeah.
Especially, as a hopeless romantic myself, but then to experience basically this giant trauma of your big sister who you adore almost dying because of the thing that you've always thought is most important in the world, and to have to like kind of rebuild your own personality based on what you think it should be led to what to me was a very interesting character to play with because she's very cautious, but underneath the caution is still that little girl.
Mhm.
Still the girl with the maps hiding under the table. She still enjoys all the places she gets to go to, but it's under this layer of fear. And that led to some really fun character work for me.
Yeah. And she's on a boat getting to do all of that.
Yes, and she's, like, so scared of it. She's so, like so regimented and so afraid of things going off the plan, but it's like, you just wanna be like, "Let go, it's fine. It's a
Yeah.
cruise ship, you really it's pretty regimented whether you want it to be or not."
Right, exactly. So, aside from the characters that we already know, you're also creating some original characters. So, we were curious if you were inspired by any of Austen's characters when creating these new characters, slash also like when you're fleshing out the well-known characters that we know and love, or like do you pull from other sources or kind of both? Like what's your character building process for these books?
Yeah, so it's a little bit of pulling from, like, sort of or at least for the smaller characters, I'm definitely pulling from some, like, fun Austen tropes, like
Mhm.
your fops and your silly friends, like, the small minor characters in Austen are always the most fun, just sort of running around doing quips. So I feel like some of the fake dates that Marianne goes on, like Torden, my favorite fake date character,
Torden.
Gordon, who's this, like, Norwegian crew member who decides out of nowhere that he's gonna pretend to be a member of the British royal family.
Iconic.
He is, by the way, named after, my favorite love interest in my friend Anna Bright's book, The Beholders. That's my little reference
Ooh,
there. If you're
love
a fan
that.
of, like, romantic fantasies, that's an amazing book, and you should absolutely read
You
it.
know our listeners all are, so they're
Yes.
gonna get it.
You'll have a great time. So that was kinda just, like, I love getting to take those little characters and just make them extremely silly. That's just, like, such a blast. That's for our sort of, like, larger side characters, specifically Gabe, who is really our biggest original character. For those, I feel like I don't draw as much inspiration from Austen, if only because, like, there are such good archetypes that already exist within her work for the Romanceers, but, like, they're usually also in the book. Edward is there.
Mhm.
Brandon is adjacent, you can't have that same character wandering through again. So he draws just a lot of inspiration from, like, other romance tropes that I enjoy, like, I really wanted to go for kind of a grumpy sunshine thing,
Love
because
him. Yeah.
Margaret, for all of her, like, cynicism, is a very sunshiny and bright person, and so I had so much fun putting that in for him. I drew some extra inspiration from my husband for this one, which was fun. I specifically Gabe is Brazilian, and that was, like, in homage to my husband's family, who are all from Brazil, so that was a really fun, like, little character flavor to toss into that, but I especially, like, just, like my husband is not a smiler, and I love the idea that, like, you get to know people like that over time and how rewarding it is when you do get to know them, like, people who are shy or a little bit quiet, it is almost more joyous when you finally break them open and see, like, the super delightful person inside because you had to work for it a little bit more, and that's really what I wanted to do with Gabe as well, was be like, "Oh, yeah, here's this just, kind of slightly broody, like, quiet crew member, and when the right person breaks him open, he's kinda just a soft romantic cuddle ball inside."
Yeah, I love that he was a tech guy too, like,
Mhm.
I was reading, like, reviews and such of the book, and everyone was like, "Gabe." He's such a little dreamboat.
Oh my gosh, I love Gabe, he's a delight.
Yeah. So, Eleanor and Marianne are kind of side characters in this
Mhm.
book, aside from being obviously Margaret's biggest inspirations in life.
Right.
Um, what elements of their stories and their characters did you feel were most essential to carry over to this story?
Yeah, so I'll start with Eleanor because for her, it really was just, like, carrying over how in love she and Edward are, even if Margaret, like, absolutely doesn't really pick up on that right away. They are my favorite Jane Austen love story. Edward is my favorite Jane Austen hero. So capturing that was just, like, such a joy to write. I probably could have written, like, half a dozen more, just Eleanor and Edward being, like, cute and in love scenes. They would have done nothing for the plot, but I would have had a great time doing them. So having her there, but also showing the ways that she was, still a person and the parts where you see her break down in the original novel, like, I wanted to show that she still did that now, she still gets frustrated with Marianne. She's still frustrated with the situation she finds herself in, but for her, it really was just, like, making that love story for her and Edward, showing that they were happy, that they were still killing it, and for Marianne, because Marianne is a bigger character than Eleanor, really,
Yeah.
she's a lot more involved in the plot, and for her, I really did just wanna delve into that, like, did she make the right decision? And what is she like after she went through this big event? Because you see so little of her post, accident. She's sick for a lot of it. And then she and Brandon get together very quickly, and Austen only does so much dialogue anyway. Like, a lot of it is pretty, straightforward descriptions. You don't see as much of her. And I wanted to sort of see what had happened to her and delve into that while still not losing who Marianne is a character and also not making her seem like a silly fop of a person herself. Which I think would be an easy trap to fall into with Marianne because she is still bright, she's bubbly, she's fun, she shows up with her big floppy hat and her Lily Pulitzer and her like it's 5 o'clock somewhere attitude, but I still wanted her to be like this very complex person, who was going through a pretty major traumatic event even now, like breaking up with the guy she'd been with for 6 years.
Totally, and, like, you see that a lot, I think, when Margaret is, trying to set her up with people,
Mhm.
and her mood shifts, like, so subtly, like, being in a good mood to being like, "Okay,"
Yeah.
and her smile falling a little bit, and Margaret not really understanding what that's about because she's, like, assuming that Marianne is that, like, sort of butterfly person flitting
Yeah,
from
exactly.
relationship to relationship.
Yeah. Margaret definitely sees her as, like, a manic pixie dream girl still, like, Margaret sees the older sisters
Absolutely.
as the archetypes of themselves, and so a lot of this is her like, Margaret having to unpack, like, they're not just, like, these, like, older sisters who are specific molds, like, they're complex people.
Yeah, and then also having to understand for herself that there's a Margaret Dashwood beyond just following in one of her sister's
Exactly.
footsteps.
Yeah.
Yeah, a beautiful arc for Margaret.
Thanks.
So, you have really developed a niche in writing rom-coms following these side characters, as we've discussed a lot. How does that feel just, like, in the Austen world? What does that feel like for you as an Austen fan?
I mean, it's such an honor, like I said earlier, like, to be able to, like, have even, like, the smallest dip into the canon, that people would look at my books alongside things like, Emma approved Elizabeth Bennet Diaries or the movies, and be like just to even an ounce of that, or the idea that, like, I could be someone's introduction to Jane Austen,
Mhm,
since the books are written for a teen audience, and not every teen has read Jane Austen, it's, a very reasonable thing to not have picked up at 15.
totally.
That's an amazing idea too, that, like, someone would be like, "Oh, like, I liked this book, like, let's read the source material." Even, like, my mom had not read any Jane Austen, and she read Pride and Prejudice after reading Accomplished, and I'm like, "Oh, like, that's such a nice thing, I get to, like, even, bring folks who are not teens,
Yeah.
into that world."
That's so beautiful. I love that. I feel like when we've talked about things like, Lizzie Bennet Diaries or Emma Approved, that's also been the kind of general consensus is that anything that brings in more audience to
Yes.
reading Austen is good stuff.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I love that about the Austen fandom too, is that, like, they just want more people to, like, know about this stuff. Like, it's a very non-gatekeepy community we've
Yes.
found as opposed to, like, other fandoms that we're a part of, like Star Wars, for example, is very gatekeepy,
Yeah.
and Austen is just like, "Oh, you're interested in the Regency era?
Yeah,
Yay."
please, please come in, and I have found that, all the Austen fans I've interacted with have been so lovely and generous and so willing to embrace, like, a different take on their favorite characters, which is just lovely to see.
Yeah, because there is so much to be mined there, like, in her characters, and they do lend themselves so well to modern adaptation,
Mhm.
and I found this because obviously we read a lot of Austen adaptations,
Sure.
is that, like, some people are very much, like, purists, like, "I want the story as it is," but, like, that's why you watch the 1995 Pride and Prejudice, for example. Like, that exists.
I don't think that's, like, the reason you need adaptation, personally.
Exactly. Like, you read adaptations to see what other interpretations of these characters there can be, and so, like, I've personally released myself from worrying about the plot.
Yeah, I mean, I think they just serve different purposes too. Like for Accomplished, I was going for much more of like a beat by beat,
Mhm.
just because it was like happening alongside the story. And for Ghosted, I stuck slightly closer to the plot. It's still pretty loose, compared to Accomplished. I'm doing my best to not say any details about Ghosted, Molly.
You're doing so well, I have no idea what it's about.
Fantastic. There could be ghosts. There might not be. It's impossible to say. Like there's a place called Northanger Abbey there. There's no more details than that. Um,
Amazing.
but like since this is its own thing, it is sort of a secondary story on top of that story. I got to have even more freedom, which was just a fun and different exercise. It was harder because I did like and accomplish. I will say the benefit of the beat by beat is that someone else has made the outline for you, and that person is Jane Austen, and
Totally.
she's very good at plots.
Yes.
It's harder when you have to make your own plots, but it's a good exercise and still like just brings a different type of book into the world.
Yeah, and you get to pull out different elements of the characters that, like, may or may not be there in the original,
Yeah.
but that you get to, like, see what would happen if this character was this way, or what would happen if this character did this thing, and I just think that's so fun.
Yeah, I agree.
So, what was the hardest part of this story to write?
I think honestly getting the plot was probably the most challenging part for this because you are kind of dealing with 2 to 3 different arcs, which is the most sort of main characters going through things that I've done in a book so far, just because you have Marianne and Margaret each on kind of their own journey, even though Margaret is the main character, like by far. Marianne's still going through, her own character journey there, closer to the way that a main character would. So you have to deal with that, and then also dealing with that alongside a pre-constrained timeline. That actually, I changed my mind. The hardest part was that I put a timeline on this ship and I said when you would be in certain places, and then I had to deal with that, and that sucked.
Yep.
I was like, but I want like it'd make more sense for them to immediately go from this dinner into NASA. But they were in NASA yesterday, and that means that we have to go to the private island and to Key West still, and we have to deal with 2 sea days. And now there's been too many weeks since the last thing happened. But also I need to have this major like event happening near the end of the book, but I need enough time left in that for like this character development to have happened. That was a nightmare. I'm never doing that again. Never saying real times. I'm also like never saying real places. My poor copy editor who had to like re-explain the geography of Key West to me, a place I've been many times and like looked
Oh
at
my
maps
god.
of to do this. I still have such a poor sense of direction
Me
that she had to
too.
be like, this is not the direction that anything is. I'm so sorry. Just honestly, just shoot me. It's probably easier and have someone else write the book at this point. Like we can't. So I'm going back to my made up boarding school settings after
Yeah.
this.
That's so funny, but it is, like, so important that those things all were adhered to because
Yeah.
then in the experience of reading the book, you don't have to worry about, like, "But wait, how did they get from this place to this place?"
Oh, it's so crucial. Yeah.
Yeah, and so, like, it made as hard as it was for you, and I'm sorry, it made this experience of reading the book very smooth.
I'm very glad. And honestly, all the props in the world, my copy editor, who at one point just had to make me a timeline because I was like, I've lost it. I don't know. I think we might be in week 3. I think I might be in week 4. I couldn't begin to tell you.
Oh my god, that's so
Especially
funny.
like editing things and then like moving scenes around. Having to move scenes around while still keeping the timeline intact. Like drafting a timeline is fine. Editing a timeline's a nightmare.
Oh, yeah, I bet.
But all the dates work out. This is technically set in the summer of 2024.
Amazing.
The Saturdays line up, the Wednesdays line up. It's great.
So impressive. So on the flip side of that, what was the most fun part to write? Or not even part if there isn't a specific part, but like what was the most fun element of the story to write?
Edward.
I love
I
Edward.
love Edward so much. Like Edward and Eleanor, but also I really loved doing my Edward and Margaret scenes because they have such a beautiful like big brother little sister relationship that I
They
just
really do.
adored writing. There were a few scenes that had to get cut from that just for like time, but like every time that they were together and you got to see who Edward is, and it was just like such a delight. So I loved writing like the emotional core of those, but also just like the silly details of who Edward and also Eleanor are as people. Like there's a pickleball scene where they show up in like intense matching pickleball outfits that are just like we're like we play pickleball all the time. We're so good at it. I'm like, well, of course you are. Like
Yeah, that made perfect sense to me.
you know that Eleanor and Edward are like down at the public courts, like beating every 75-year-old couple in like the immediate 10-mile radius, just crushing it. So that sort of thing was just like a blast.
They were couple goals. I loved them so much. I couldn't stop thinking about Edward and Margaret sword fighting during all of their interactions. I was like, wait, that's so sweet.
And that's honestly what it comes down to. That's one of my favorite scenes in the movie. And like I was just like, I need to capture that exact moment of him just like doing his best and doing a pretty great job. Like some of my favorite emotional scenes in the book are Margaret and Edward scenes where they're just sort of together.
Yeah. So you probably answered my next question, which was who was your favorite Sense and Sensibility
Oh, it's
character
Edward.
to
Sorry, was it
adapt?
not clear that
Yeah.
it's Edward?
Yeah. So I'll skip to who was hardest to adapt.
Probably Marianne. For similar reasons of needing to like the core of her character is so important, but also like having to kind of deconstruct what happens to her at the end of the novel. Because we do break her and Brandon up. And obviously that's saying that like something is different than what happened in Austin. And so that was the trickiest sort of weave that thread of moving her through the story in a way that was still authentic to her. And didn't, I don't think that the character of Marianne in this book is like very different from the character of Marianne in the original Austen. It's just, 6 years later. And she is kind of reverting to who she was, with Willoughby and stuff like that in this attempt to try to get her life back. But ultimately, just like working her through line through was probably the most challenging, but also very rewarding. I'm really pleased with how she turned out and where she kind of ends up. No spoilers, but I think people will be happy with where she ends up.
Yes, I was very happy with where she ended up.
Yeah. Her final scenes were some of my favorite to write. They were just like there's some swoon-worthy magic going on there.
Yeah. There was also some high drama
Oh
in the end of
yeah.
this book.
There's a
Yeah.
hurricane, Molly.
Yeah. I was like, "Oh, we're going there."
Just throwing a hurricane into things, yeah.
Which is one of the reasons I'll never go on a cruise, one, because I get seasick. So and I actually so I was when I was reading the book, I've always had, like, the thought maybe a cruise, like, maybe I wouldn't get so seasick because so many people do cruises and they're fine. But even just reading your descriptions of, like, oh, she thought she had gotten used to the swaying of the ship, but then she wasn't all of a sudden I was like, "Oh, wait, no, I would be miserable the entire
I
time."
do think if you get seasick, you should avoid a cruise because even though, like, you don't necessarily feel it, if it hits a little bit of roughness, like, you will feel the movement of the ship. Although the patches and, like, the wristbands and the Dramamine do amazing things, but cruises are not for everyone, and that's okay. You probably won't hit a hurricane, though, or if you do, you probably won't get lost.
Right, like, I think that if there was a hurricane, I would not wander into the, like, middle of the woods.
Right, I had to fudge a little bit some of the safety procedures that would happen with, like, the situation that we find ourselves in with the hurricane, and I'm trying to be vague because I don't wanna spoil too much of it, like, the back of the book
Yeah.
tells you there's a hurricane, but we don't need to go into details. Like, the situation that I describe happening could happen logistically, which is also kind of a pain in the neck to write because, like, I had to figure out a way for that to happen in a way that wouldn't have, like, every cruise cast member I know, like, beating down my door being like, "We would never how what? No." So, like, it could happen, but it's not going to.
Right,
Like,
right.
just don't wander away and you'll be okay.
Yeah, that's good to
Yeah,
know.
stick with the
But,
group,
yeah,
you'll be fine.
I don't think I'll ever find myself in that position because I sometimes get motion sickness just, like, if I become aware of my body in space and I suddenly I'm like, "Oh my god, the world is turning and I am spinning at however many miles per hour." I, like, sometimes get aware of that. I don't wanna make any of our listeners suddenly aware. I know that's not actually
Yeah,
possible.
trigger warning for the sudden awareness of your body in space, Molly.
I know it's not actually possible to get seasick from the spinning of the earth, but sometimes I just do, and maybe this is a medical condition that I should get checked out,
Yeah,
like,
are your
with my
inner
inner
ears
ears.
okay? I'm, like,
Yeah.
worried they're not.
Anyway, so I probably won't ever find myself
Yeah,
on a
oh my
cruise,
god,
but
never get on a boat, like
happy to read about it, though.
yeah, I'm glad I
So
can take you on the closest you should ever come to that journey within the pages, perhaps, like, standing still in the grass so you know you're safe.
absolutely, yeah. Well, that is the end of my questions for you. Thank you so much for allowing us to read this book before it is on sale to the public. We were so excited that you were doing a book that we were actually able to cover.
I know, I was so glad to.
And thank you so much for coming on the podcast and talking with me. And Becca obviously sends her regards.
Yes, loved Becca. But on the bright side, we could bash Brandon and Marianne's relationship more than we perhaps could if she was here. So there's that.
Yes, and again, apologies to Becca and all of the Brandon Marianne purists out there, but there are things to be interrogated about it, you
Yes,
know?
and if you're like, I'm afraid of this book because I don't want to see Brandon and Marianne broke up, don't worry. Just
Don't worry
you'll
too
be
much.
okay. Don't panic.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, they do love each other so much. Not even, I mean, just like their relationship comes together in the original source material as like a very comforting
Yes. It just
thing, which
it
is
fits. You know,
okay.
it's
Yeah,
okay to have things that are like I do stand by the original point of the book, which is that you don't need to have a big dramatic romance to have a romance.
absolutely.
But, people just get confused. Your 20s are hard. I think we can all agree. Like, that was kind of an interesting I realize I'm, like, jumping ahead. We're, like, in the outro. But, like, that was a fun thing as, like, an adult to get to play with Marianne and Eleanor's, like, being adults. I kinda got to cheat and put a little bit of, like, adult rom-com in my YA.
Yeah, and I also like yes, and again, we are in the outro, but like who cares? Eleanor and Edward, even though they do have this like big romance, and that is one of the points of the book is that like Margaret doesn't necessarily see everything that's going on with them. They are couple goals in that like they're just happy and like calm
Mhm.
and like they have their routines and I love that.
Yes, and they have matching Hawaiian shirts. I
Which
mean,
of course.
that's the goal right there.
Yeah, that's all I need in a
Yeah. I
relationship.
honestly I could have nothing else than just the matching Hawaiian shirts, and I'd be happy.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Anyway, now we
Well,
can outro the podcast.
yes. So thank you again so much for coming on. Listeners, thank you for listening. For next episode, we will be back into persuasion
Yes.
with chapters 6 and
Yes,
7.
I love that I got to come on, but, like, I also need you to get back to Persuasion so we can keep hearing your thoughts on that, so I'm glad we're just taking a one-week break.
Yeah, we have this one. We're gonna be taking another little break in a couple of weeks for another Austen adaptation, which we will reveal shortly.
Ooh.
But before we end, Amanda, where can the listeners find you?
Yes, so you can find me physically in the world for the next couple weeks, which is very exciting. Normally, I'm
Yeah,
just sort of ephemeral, but at the moment, you can find me physically. So if you listen to this very early on the day of my book release, I will be doing my launch party at One More Page Books in Arlington, Virginia at 7 p.m. Then I'm heading to Sunrose Books in Ocean City, New Jersey. On Saturday, July 20th, I'll be there from 11 to 1 doing like a fun little outdoor signing. I will be purchasing saltwater taffy to give out in bulk. So, honestly, even
oh
if
my
you
god,
don't care
amazing.
about books, but you like saltwater taffy and you're somehow still listening to this podcast, that's a good stop. And then that Monday, I will be back in Pittsburgh where I live doing my Pittsburgh launch at White Whale Books at 7 p.m. So that's Monday, July 22nd. I have a couple of Virginia stops in August that are on my social media. So you can find me there at Quainiac, Quainiac. That's my handle on all social media. I'm trying to do TikTok. Pity follow me. I'd really appreciate it.
Honestly, same.
Yeah.
I've done like 2 reels or what are they called? Videos,
I don't
TikToks
even know.
ever.
TikToks, I guess.
Yeah, I really wanna get into it because I know that's where the growth
I know.
is,
I don't know why we can't just
but
write
it's
long
hard.
letters to each other. That would be I'm not that I'm great at that either, but that I understand it, you know?
Yeah, exactly. Well, until next time, listeners, stay proper.
Toodaloo and anchors away.
Nice. Pod and Prejudice is edited by Molly Burdick and audio produced by Graham Cook. Our show art is designed by Torrance Brown. Our show is transcribed by SpeechDocs Podcast Transcription. For transcripts and to learn more about our team, check out our website at podandprejudice.com. To keep up with the show, you can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at Pod and Prejudice. If you love what you hear, check out our Patreon at patreon.com/podandprejudice to see how you can support us, or just drop us a rating and a review wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks for listening.